A reading from the letter of Paul to the Romans. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation awaits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For by hope we have been saved. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God.
We hope you'll sing along, and we hope that after the 5th verse, if we happen to sing some shape note shapes, you won't be alarmed, but you'll just sing fa, la, la as you wish. Lo, 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 lo. We praise the tiny perfect moles that garden underground, the ant, the worm, the nematode, wherever they are found, wherever they are found. They live their whole lives in the dark, unseen by human sight. The earth is like the air to them, their day is like our night, their day is like our night. They turn the soil and till it, they make the plants to thrive. The earth would be a desert if they were not alive, if they were not alive. The little carrion beetles that seek unlikely places return our hearts to elements and tidy up our spaces, and tidy up our spaces. And so for God's small creatures beneath the field and wood, let us today give joyful thanks, for God has found them good, for God has found them good. So fa, 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 la, sol, so, la, so, fa, so, la, so. So, la, la, sa, la, so, sa, la, so, la, fa, fa. La, so, fa, so, la, so, fa.
A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they didn't have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. After explaining his use of parables, Jesus continued. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and doesn't understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. The gospel of Christ.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Just wave if you can hear me, okay? All right, good. All right, here we go. Karen Armstrong, as many people know, is a well-known writer on world religions. And in her latest book, The Lost Art of Scripture, she explains that very early on, Jewish rabbinical schools and their students moved away from using literal interpretations of the scriptures in their teachings. The Torah, she writes, must be revivified by living voices in every generation. So in synagogues and schools, teachings were argued over and often vehemently. And even if a certain majority view prevailed, the other diverse interpretations were often still preserved in the body of the Talmud. Now, everyone knows the beloved parable of the sower in today's gospel, and I'm sure if you went to Sunday school, it was one of the first things you learned about. But today, in the spirit of that rabbinical tradition, and with a nod to Rabbi Jesus, I'm going to do a 21st century riff on the original story. A sower went out to sow, he said, but some of the seeds fell on the path and the birds ate them up. A sower went out to sow. Every summer for the past 10 years, leaving his wife and family of 4 children behind in Mexico, this sower of seeds traveled to Canada to work in the fields on southwest Ontario. The fruits of his labor, the money he earned and sent home, helped to provide a life and a home for his wife and 4 children. And so in the spring of this year, Juan Lopez Chaparro returned once more to the farm in Norfolk country to sow and harvest their crop. He shared the rundown, crowded bunkhouse. He shared a communal kitchen and the showers with several other migrant workers. But little did Juan know, this year he was also sharing the space with myriads of tiny, living but invisible cells that were circling around the space like vultures ready to pounce and crush out his fragile life, and also the seeds of hope that he carried with him. When a predatory flock of COVID-19 cells entered his system, Juan was not too concerned at first, and he continued to use the communal shower facilities. But as he grew sicker and weaker, he became afraid, very afraid. He had no coverage for healthcare, leave alone for expensive treatment in a hospital. Finally, an ambulance did come and take his already broken body to the hospital, where he died, completely alone. The seeds of his harvest, eaten up and destroyed by the predatory parasite which had flourished in the conditions that he was forced to endure. Listen, all you that have ears to hear. A sower went out to sow. Berta Cáceres was born in La Esperanza, Honduras. She was a member of the Lenca indigenous people. She grew up in the 1970s in a family of social activists and sowers of seeds of hope. Her mother was elected as a congresswoman and later became governor of the Department of Intibucá. Her daughter Berta studied education at university and graduated with a teaching degree. In 1993, while she was still a student, Berta Cáceres co-founded the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, known as COPIN. Its role was to highlight the abuse and also to support indigenous people's rights in Honduras. And soon, Berta became a leader of many protests against illegal logging, as well as against the US military bases in Lenca. Led by Cáceres, COPIN also fought against the construction of a hydroelectric dam that would endanger local communities and cut off their water supply. And they succeeded in making two of the dam's major backers withdraw support. The seeds were flourishing. But just as they were starting to bear fruit and garnering international acclaim, when Berta Cáceres won the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2016, her inspiring and courageous hope and actions had also aroused the ire of business and corporate interests. They were seething with anger over her increasing successes. So in March 2016, two gunmen broke into her house and shot her dead. The seeds of her life shattered on the hard rocks of political corruption and corporate greed. Listen, all you who have ears to hear. A sower went out to sow. A man was born and grew up in Houston, Texas. He was a hip hop artist and also a youth mentor at his church. But in 1997, George Floyd's life went off the rails, and he spent 4 years in jail. When he was released, Floyd moved to Minneapolis to make a fresh start and to be a better father to his children. His life really seemed to be on the right track, and he was sowing good seeds when he was hired as a security guard at a restaurant. He became known by his friends there as the gentle giant, someone who had their back, they said, and would be there for them if help was needed. But then again came COVID-19. The restaurant where Floyd worked closed its doors, and he was laid off. On May 25th, he allegedly passed counterfeit money to buy a pack of cigarettes. Just a pack of cigarettes. He was arrested, and he was hauled out into a cop car by a posse of police. Then Floyd's bruised body fell on the street and into a bed of thorns. The repeated blows and kicks from several cops who surrounded him like tall weeds and towered over him and beat the life out of him. One of them knelt right on his neck. "I can't breathe," were Floyd's last words, as the small seeds of hope were choked right out of him. "I can't breathe. It is finished." And so he breathed his last and gave over his spirit on the cross of racism. Listen, all you that have ears to hear. A sower went out to sow. In 1847, a sower of faith gave an anonymous gift for the building of a church in Toronto. Mary Lambert Swale was delighted when construction started on the Church of the Holy Trinity. It was in St. John's Ward, an area of the city that had become home to immigrants, escaped slaves, and other marginalized people. And Mary Swale insisted that they should come and go freely with no charge for worship or other services. The seed of this new church plant grew and flourished, nourished by the great diversity of people who came through its doors. And during the Depression years of the 1930s, the then rector, John Frank, sowed the seeds of a new crop inspired by the social gospel. And the Church of the Holy Trinity grew another great harvest of further outreach and development. But then came the 1970s. Enter the big Cadillac Fairview Corporation with plans for the construction of a new flagship shopping mall, which would be called the Eaton Center. The Church of the Holy Trinity was threatened with demolition to make way for the new Eaton Center. But the seeds of this church were firmly rooted, watered, and planted, and it had borne fruit in a strong and determined congregation, many of whom are here today. And they rose to the defense of this sacred space and forced the great excavators to bypass the building of the church. And thus, to borrow another parable of Rabbi Jesus, the seeds that were sown at Holy Trinity have not only borne fruit in a rich harvest of faithful witness in the city, but they've also grown into a great tree of faith, like a tiny mustard seed that flourished and grew. And now its branches shelter many fledgling organizations. The Hispanic congregation of San Esteban built their nest here in 2007, as did the Toronto Urban Native Centre just last year. And so, in 2020, as the vicious claws of COVID-19 forced the closure of downtown Toronto and its corporate class flew from the city, the doors of the Church of the Holy Trinity remained open to welcome the Rabbi Jesus, now the risen Christ, who comes to us in the hungry, the homeless, and the lonely, who have remained without shelter in the city. Like a stubborn and seedy presence, growing and flourishing amidst the looming towers of corporate capitalism, Holy Trinity refuses to be silenced and still reaps a great harvest. A harvest like what the mystic Hildegard of Bingen called a harvest of Viriditas. Wonderful word that means vitality, fecundity, lushness, and growth. And now too, the seeds planted by Juan Chaparro, Berta Cáceres, and George Floyd that seemed to have died as they fell to the ground have yet taken root in a new harvest of courage, movements for justice, and the greening of hope for a better future. They have joined the seeding of hope for what Paul calls the new creation. For as Rabbi Jesus said, unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it will live again and bear much fruit. As Paul to the Romans, we know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. But creation waits with eager longing to give birth to the fruits of the Creator's Spirit in the hopes and seeds of a new earth. We await with longing, eagerly, for the new birth of the new creation. What seeds of hope and longing are being planted in the soil of your life? As you perhaps groan now in these difficult times, and yet continue to labor for the fruit of a new creation. Listen, all you that have ears to hear.